Think of basically just engaging in civics, societal problems, social issues, talking about it, discussing it with your fellow citizens. And the reason why we have it in parentheses digital is because these are aspects of just being a good citizen, online and offline. So just to give you a sense of who these people were that were part of our social media study, it was 700 middle school students in the greater Boston area. The average age was 12 and a half, 6th to 8th grade. It was pretty much gender divided between a male and female. And it was 90% participation rate, which means that the representation of that community was pretty good. It was very racially, ethnically diverse. Less than half were non-white. And we had a diversity in terms of socioeconomic status, too, from one school being 8% low income to another school being 75% low income in an inner city urban school. So when we look at digital citizenship of our middle school youth, we asked them things like, when people talk about their good news and their bad news online, do you respond? Like, do you try to reach out to somebody? And it looks like in 6th and 7th grade, they're a little bit more likely to reach out with the good news. The bad news is a little bit more iffy. Maybe it's a little dicey for them to talk to somebody about the bad news. But in 8th grade, it seems like it's a little bit more evenly, distributed. So it's interesting how people also start to engage in different dialogue as they get older. People talk a lot about the negative aspects, like the cyberbullying and the mean, the comments, the rumor spreading, but we want to also emphasize that people are giving and receiving social emotional support online in middle school. 60% of our sample said that they provide online support, a little bit over half say they receive online support. The topics that are underneath each column represent the top 5 topics that they mentioned they needed help on. School, worries and anxieties, getting along with others, people that they care about, people that they don't get along with. The ones that are highlighted, dating on this side and family on that side, are the ones that don't overlap between the two. People are more likely to provide support about dating and romantic interests, and people are more likely to receive more support about their family issues. There's still a lot of ongoing controversy about, Facebook depression. Are people getting more depressed by being on social media? Are they already depressed when they already log on? It seems like in our studies, at least, it depends on who you are, how you use social media. There's a concept called differential susceptibility, and so it depends on who you are. Like, do you think it's really important to get likes and comments on your posts? Do you feel hurt when people ignore you online? So it really depends on who you are and how this affects you. Do you think it's really important not to break that Snapchat streak? We talked to middle school students who would feel really upset and angry when somebody cut out their streak after it'd been happening for a whole year, a streak. And so it depends on who you are. For us, in terms of social emotional well-being, it was really the online anxiety that was the underlying kind of pervasiveness across all the different kinds of people that use social media. Depression kind of came in depending on how you used it. Like if you felt hurt by individual actions or receiving unwanted sex messages online. If you really cared about being liked and having comments posted, you cared more about being popular. So it really depends on who you are and how you use it. So as Megan said, we are going to follow up these students and collect new data for 3 years for an NIH-funded study. Upcoming are 2 presenters that are going to talk about more of the qualitative pieces. Stephanie's going to talk about the interview data and who are these non-social media users, the ones that don't want to sign up for a social media account even though the majority of their peers are on it. And also Cynthia is going to talk about our Instagram coding analyses where we got to follow people on Instagram for 6 months to see what they're doing on Instagram. This is all with parental permission, of course. Our other study that we're going to talk about, it has to do with election, identity, media, attitudes. This study started back when Obama was in the re-election campaign mode in 2012, 2013, and then we continued in 2016 and 2017 during the Trump election time period. We've collected almost 5,000 surveys from around the country and the world. We also collected 44 follow-up interviews. So 26 countries, 48 US states, and I'm happy to announce that as of today, we are going to do a wave 4 we're opening up a midterm election survey. So we will be talking more about what people are thinking in 2018, and you've got to stay tuned for that, maybe next year's talk. So just to give you a little snapshot of what social issues people cared about back in 2012, 2013, so around the post-Obama re-election, people really care about quality education for everybody, socioeconomic divide, poverty. During the pre-Trump election period, which was pre-November, this is when everybody projected that Hillary Clinton was going to win. Okay, these were the most important topics for people: socioeconomic divide, environment, gun violence, and then this is what happened when Trump was elected. These were the number one fears, the things that the president should address. Environment was way up to the top. Socioeconomic divide is always a perennial issue, but international peace definitely shot up there. And that was in 2016. Did the election in 2016 make people want to be more politically involved? 69% of our sample said yes. And in what ways? A lot of people heard about the marches that went across the country. And yes, 46% said they attended a protest, but they also were engaged civically in other ways. They boycotted businesses. They donated to social causes that they were afraid that would lose funding. They signed petitions, and they engaged others with more political dialogue. So there's a lot of one-on-one type of things, too, not just public displays of civic engagement. So watch out for the midterm election results, and we're going to hopefully present some of that at our next lunchtime seminar. Sabina is going to talk about the characteristics of non-voters from the 2016 election, and also Elidie is going to talk about some of the acts of oppression and kindness that were shown to each other after the election of Trump. So thank you so much, and take it away.
Hi, so I'm just going to talk a little bit about why some middle schoolers avoid creating social media accounts for themselves. Okay, so just for some background information, like Dr. Charmarman said, we conducted a quantitative survey with 700 middle schoolers from three nearby different schools, and a qualitative interview with 24 different middle schoolers. And in this instance, we're defining social media as having their own account with their own name in Snapchat and or Instagram. That means we're not counting gaming, email, FaceTiming, or just like looking onto your friends or your siblings' Snapchat account. So just to begin with, we have some reasons on why middle schoolers first started using social media out of the 700 that we've interviewed. The numbers aren't going to add up to 100 because they got to choose up to 5, but one of the really interesting things we found were that a lot of it is about curiosity. They want to know what's going on in their peer groups, in the school, as well as they want to keep in touch with everybody. They want to talk to their family and friends about the latest news and curiosity. But across from that, we noticed that 20% out of the 700 interviewed do not have social media accounts, with an average of 21% across all grades. As they get older, they tend to have a social media account of their own. And 8 out of the 24 that we interviewed qualitatively, so that I'm going to use the quotes from, don't have their own social media accounts, although this doesn't mean that they're not connected and aware of what's going on social media. So that leads to the question of, why are some students not creating their own social media accounts? They're curious, they want to know what's going on, and the large majority of their peers have them, so why not just make one for your own? Our preliminary theory, we're not done with the study yet, qualitatively or quantitatively, but our theory for now is that social interactions outside of social media, they're finding those outside of social media, and they're not curious enough to sign up for social media. They don't feel the need to create an account to be connected. A lot of this is because they're going onto someone else's account, but also because they might be involved with more heavily involved with other groups such as gaming or sports or drama clubs, so where they're getting a lot of the social interactions and the gossip and what's going on, as well as just that social media is not viewed as worth it. Kids who do not have their own account doesn't mean that they're not having information about what's going on. A lot of times they're getting secondhand information from their parents and friends, older siblings. They're also seeing people getting into trouble because of social media account, either because of cyberbullying or people being really mean online and like getting in trouble with the school. There's also issues of access. A lot of times, if you don't have a smartphone, it's not seen as worth it to have a social media account. So that's where we're seeing a lot of people either turning towards like computer games or just staying away from that realm. They also might have other time investments. So one example from the qualitative interviews about secondhand information showing like meanness for online that kids are witnessing is that this is Marie, who we interviewed. She's 14, grade 8, a girl. She watches YouTube, doesn't have social media. When asked, she said, "I don't think I'll ever sign up for social media." She saw her older cousins be really hurt online, and this is something that happened years ago and was passed down from an aunt to her mom about the cousins years ago, and it still impacts her into not creating her own account. She's not curious enough about it, and a lot of it is because she's seeing people being hurt and doesn't want to. Social media is not worth it. Another example is about meanness directed towards larger communities, not someone that you might know directly, but against a certain gender or the LGBTQ plus community. Even stuff that isn't directed towards me still affects me because it's affecting people around me. This is Orlando, Marie's sibling. She's also a girl, age 12, grade 7. She has a Gmail account, has YouTube, and looks at Pinterest, doesn't sign up for her own Pinterest account, doesn't have any other social media accounts. I don't really know what it is. I just don't want to go through it either. A lot of people just don't want to be open to like a lot of the attacks and accounts of meanness that they're seeing online, although they might be curious and still want to be connected to their community. Another example of getting into trouble is that in different schools there have been different incidents of cyberbullying, people posting inappropriate content in a variety of ways, and middle schoolers don't want to get into trouble. We see that this trend goes down as they get older, but a 7th grader, Ariana, age 12, a girl who has a Pinterest account, says, "I feel like it would be better not to have it at all." And this is in relation to recounting an incident that she's not really sure of. She doesn't really know what happened. She just knows that someone did get in trouble for doing something they weren't supposed to do on social media and is thus avoiding it. So we're seeing repercussions of things that people aren't necessarily involved in, that they don't necessarily know the most about, and not with people that they may associate with, are still impacting their online choices on how to engage on social media with their peer groups. So the last example is like other time investments / dismissive attitudes. This is Arnie Niekamp, 7th grader, a boy. He uses Steam and Discord, which are two things heavily associated with gaming, playing online games and chatting, as well as YouTube. We notice a bit of a dismissive attitude that people who use social media, Instagram, and Snapchat just talk to their friends on Facebook instead of having real-life conversations with real people, kind of oversharing your life. So this ties into the idea of like identity, like disassociating with social media accounts, creating your own might push certain middle schoolers to create and base their identity as like being a non-social media user, someone who's not associated with it, and deciding and characterizing some traits based on identity from this. And just to clarify like access, this is Gabrielle, a girl age 14. She does use Instagram. She talks about how getting a smartphone made it a lot easier to use social media, while Arnie Niekamp, who has a flip phone, something that cannot type easily, is avoiding using social media. It might do so in the future, but like for now, it just makes it hard to text and thus use social media. So just some preliminary trends of non-social media users. They tend to have more careful parents, like ones that check the phone more often, and who might give them no phone or a non-smartphone. They tend to spend energy and find social interactions outside of social media, athletics, art clubs, gaming. They might view social media as just another avenue of like a method of communication, one that's not necessarily worth it because of the repercussions that's come along with it. This doesn't mean that they're not aware and that they're not using it, just that they're not willing to risk having their name and their faces assigned with like an account. They also tend to be dismissive of social media users. Not all of them, but we're seeing some trends based on identity and like how social media does take time. There is a push, especially on Snapchat and Instagram, to update more regularly, and how that's like there's time better spent elsewhere in a lot of their opinion. So this is just some preliminary trends, not signed up for social media versus gender. Girls are more likely to sign up for social media, And then for deactivated social media accounts, so people who used to have it and then deleted their account, girls are more likely at 66% compared to boys at 34% out of the 700 sample. Why does this matter? This offers insights on what pushes young people away from creating social media / profile accounts. A lot of it has to do with fear of being hurt or like getting in trouble. That means that they're present in the community and something that we might want to talk or like just observe for now. In the future, this is a continuing study. It will be really interesting to see what pushes these different people to like eventually join, if at all, social media accounts, where they're just getting a smartphone or like having like just getting older or just having more of their friends join it as pressure, and just analyzing like the different ways that different things overlap, like more time commitments or gaming stops people. So thank you. And
hello. So my portion of the presentation is on Instagram and digital citizenship, and I'm going to start with some of the topics that are highlighted in my presentation. So overall, the most read online topics were sports, school, TV celebrities, politics, and animals. And those related to relational health or wellness were bullying, health, fitness, relationships, gaming, helping others, and depression. And I wanted to highlight politics and helping others. And so some of the questions that were asked were like, have you used the internet or social media to organize an event with friends or community, which is pretty high at 71%, of the same sample that Stephanie talked about previously. And learn about politics was 67%. Encourage others to care about the world they're all pretty high, I would say. So I wanted to start with how social media is used for civic engagement. And so in these 3 screenshots, they're pages followed by some of the students in our sample. And so one of them was the Boston Roadrunners, where they're a nonprofit organization that have like organized scholarship relays and other events that benefit the community. And there's also this page that was made by students that was called Ice Cream for Charity, where they make ice cream and they sell it to their peers to raise money for different charities. And I think this is a good representation of how students can use the social media to be civically engaged in their communities and expand beyond perhaps their like neighborhood and share it with the world as well. So moving on to political conversations. Yeah. So I just want to show like 15 seconds of this video. Yeah.
You're right. I thought so.
I got into Yale Law School.
Check out the big brain on class.
It's the #1 law school in the country.
You're smart motherfucker, that's right.
I had no connections there. I got there by busting my tail.
Looks like me and Vincent caught you boys at breakfast. Sorry about that. Jen?
Okay, so yeah, so I wanted to show that video because it shows how politics are talked about on social media and how they're discussed. So it's not really like a forward, like, here's my opinion. It's more of like digital representations of your views. So the account that I got this particular video from is followed by one of the students as well. And so I wanted just to show how students also get current news, because this is such a current, something that's like happening still. And on this particular video, the views were that Kavanaugh is guilty, And so I wanted to show also something else that a student was following that showed a different perspective, just to show how what people get online is tied to someone's, the account's particular views, and not necessarily has to be in like an informed or even, yeah. So the middle one reads, remember when Potiphar's wife lied about and said Joseph tried to rape her? Women don't always tell the truth. And this is just, this was posted during the same time of the Kavanaugh trials, and so it just shows how people are getting different points of view and are being on the same platform. I also included these two other ones. This one is called Impossible, and it was one that a female student was following, and it says, there's some pictures that say like, men are scum, and Muslim women, let's get naked, which are not necessarily, I would not define feminism in that way. And I feel like, but this is also a way that students are getting, well, like kids are getting, are defining their political views through how they see it on social media. And the other one that says, she may look clean, but even the prettiest girls can carry crazy ideas. Just liberalism, progressivism, and socialism. You can't make America great again if you're infected. Ask about her politics first. So, yeah. So I wanted to explain kind of how the algorithm on Instagram works. And so basically, it takes the main factors are interest, timeliness, and relationships. So students follow these so these are all from meme accounts. So they're like accounts that that constantly post throughout the day. And so they would be showed at the top of their explore pages or their timelines. And so they would see more of that content first. And so they also, if they like the page more often, like content on that page, then they will also get more of that. There's also frequency, following, and usage. So how often you open your Instagram, how much, like what kind of content they follow. So if they like more memes, if they like more food pages, that's what you'll get more of. And so this is the old algorithm versus the new algorithm. So in the old one, it was chronological. So if you viewed it at like 9 a.m., you wouldn't see somebody's post if they posted it somewhere there. But if in the new one, you'll see if you like keep posting and like follow the rules and whatever, you'll see it on the top of your timeline. So these accounts know how to use the algorithm to get more views and likes, and so they'll constantly be posting and using these different criteria to like get their posts like bumped up. And so in conclusion, social media has a lot of fake news. And people don't have to be informed to post their beliefs and their opinions on social issues. So be informed about what kind of pages you're following and what people behind those pages. And social media can also be used for good. You can follow all of these social organizations and stay informed on different topics through the use of social media as well. Yeah.
Okay, so my name is Sabina, and I'm going to be talking about the second study that Dr. C talked about, which mostly talks about the voter sample in 2016 as well as 2012, and also talks about larger patterns of civic engagement, apathy, and geography. I'm going to be honing in on two different themes. One is kind of the large prior that we have that if you didn't vote or if you don't talk a lot about politics, there is a large chance that politics doesn't affect you or you're part of a non-marginalized group that doesn't really get affected by mainstream politics. So there's, the large priors online that, well, you didn't vote, so you probably don't get affected by politics. I'm going to be examining if that is necessarily true, if our data corresponds with that. And I'm also going to be looking at what geography tells us about non-voters and if there are concentrations of non-voters or if geography is a good, interesting factor to look at in terms of who is engaged with politics. So first, why do we care about non-voters? Why instead talk about who's actually voting? To start, firstly, 42% of eligible voters did not vote in 2016. Not only is this people who, so there are also people in this sample who did not register to vote. This is people who are registered to vote who didn't vote. There's large samples of people who are eligible to vote who didn't register to vote for various reasons, such as logistical and systematic barriers. There's a lot of different strict voter ID laws in majority Republican states, proof of citizenship tests, and purging voter rolls that are both systematic barriers that are often on racial lines as well as class lines, as well as logistical barriers such as not providing proper information about registration, making polls far away from populous centers, or having voting during the day when a lot of people are at work. We also have more studies recently that show that requiring strict voter ID drops turnout of registrants between the ages of 18 and 23, people who have recently registered, and largely voters who are African American. So understanding who is not voting not only tells us about who the psyche of people that didn't vote, but also largely about our larger policies and who these bear from voting. It also tells us about the historical patterns of denying voting rights to Black and POC voters, such as through historical literacy tests and good character tests that are based largely on race. And we can understand who might have a larger voice in participatory democracy if these particular barriers were removed. We also largely get a better understanding of polling, we can make better predictive models, and we can understand what is the actual state of politics by having greater understanding of our data. Finally, it represents the holes in our democracy. If we understand who isn't voting, we can understand who are we not reaching with our policies and who don't resonate with our political leaders. This helps us shape better policies, but also helps decide who is in office. So, what do we know about non-voters right now? In 2012, we know that most people that didn't vote had an income between $50,000 and $100,000 per year. They were between the ages of 40 and 64, and they were largely clustered in the Midwest. We also know that these non-voters were largely white and very stratified based on education. Pew Research Center also tells us that age-wise, non-voters for 2016 were largely comprised of people between the ages of 18 and 29. They were 33% of non-voters, but only 13% of voters. White voters were largely 74% of voters, but largely 52% of non-voters. 52 seems like a large percentage of non-voters, and 74 seems like a large percentage of voters, but considering general population demographics, it's a large difference between the two of them. Finally, we know that income and education, both in 2012 and 2016, largely correlated with who voted and who didn't vote. It also largely correlated with who voted on party lines. But I'm not largely going to talk about who voted or didn't vote in terms of if you voted Democrat or Republican, because factors such as political affiliation isn't really a demographic, because it's something that largely shifts between elections. People don't really consistently necessarily identify with the party. A lot of people register with the party, but their party affiliation shifts over time and changes between elections, and people often don't vote on their party lines. So, this also shows the shift in margin between the two elections and how we all know it largely shifted right. So in terms of our data set, in terms of non-voters, there were 357 non-voters. There was a question, did you or did you not vote in the 2012 presidential elections? And this is largely the question I looked at, compared this to both the 2016 version of this question, but for a lot of the questions, I largely looked at voting in the 2012 presidential elections because you had a very meaty sample size for that, which allowed a lot of interesting comparative information. Our data set also was a little bit skewed towards people in Wellesley networks, because that's largely how we circulated the survey. So there is a larger demographic skew in terms of people who are between the ages of 18 and 24 and who are in Massachusetts. So that's something to keep in mind when looking at the data that I'm about to present. So there was one question which was, why didn't you vote, for people that didn't vote? And so of the people who didn't vote, and in terms of their answers, 3 questions that I was particularly interested in terms of apathy is people who did not vote because they did not think their vote would matter, who did not care about politics, or who were apathetic about the elections. So of these particular 3 categories of people, I looked at a smaller sample size, and because that's not 357 people, that's a lot smaller, a more descriptive analysis of this showed me that 80% of these people identified as straight, 40% identified as Christian or Catholic, and 40% identify as atheist or agnostic. Interestingly enough, 92% of these were women. It was a very racially diverse sample, rather than a larger sample, which was like 50% white. There was no one racial group that was larger than other racial groups in terms of people that didn't vote because of apathy. And 50% were between the ages of 20 and 24, but almost half were between the ages of 25 and 35. So this data is pretty interesting because it tells us it's kind of against what we might think. We might think that someone who is non-white or a woman might be more motivated to think their vote would matter or care about politics, or not be apathetic because they're obviously affected by certain policies. But perhaps data shows us instead that people who are more marginalized might not find that their vote would matter, might not engage in politics because they see their political identity not being correctly represented, not being given resources to, there not being appropriate legislation to reflect certain marginalization in society. So the opposite might actually be true. Rather than assume that if you are marginalized, you will probably vote because you'll be affected. Maybe if you are marginalized, you are seeing that you're continually marginalized by society, and that might lead you to further not vote and not be engaged in politics rather than the other way around. So the second thing that I looked at is spatial isolation of voters. So this is right now just a survey of where people are generally located who didn't vote, which kind of looks like a population density map at first, with the exception of Massachusetts. But what more specifically I looked at was various ways that the census designates cities and towns and metropolitan areas to be distinguished into. So they use the Census Bureau, when they're coming up with sample sizes for populations and when they're trying to designate what size different cities are, they use various phrases and statistical analysis methods to determine what's the size of a population, where do we group them, because geography is pretty messy. How do you determine one state line to another? One thing that they use is core-based statistical areas and metropolitan statistical areas. These essentially group larger cities and suburbs that commute into these cities into large areas. And these are basically networks of association as well as networks of resources. You can think of these as like large incorporated areas where there's public libraries, where there's infrastructure, where there's large representation in politics, because there's a lot of engagement between a large city and smaller suburbs. This can be thought of as like New York City and Newark and Long Island and related areas where maybe the cities themselves are pretty small, like smaller suburbs in Long Island or New Jersey are pretty small, but related to New York City, they often have similar amounts of transportation into larger metropolitan areas, or they have access to similar resources. Obviously, within these metropolitan and micropolitan areas, there's large disparities socioeconomically between different groups of people, but largely in terms of representation for politics, they're given like the same amount. Like if they have like one representative or one governor, they have that kind of similar access. Versus census-designated places and unincorporated areas and communities. These are basically concentrations of populations that are used for statistical purposes, but cannot be looked at in the same way as micropolitan or metropolitan areas because they're often self-governing, and they're administered as part of larger administrative districts within either like the state or a county or the country, rather than like more specific administrative representative like government systems. So it's something that is rather isolated. These are often really remote and sparsely populated areas rather than larger and more connected and more community-based centers. So I found that a really large, significant amount of people that didn't vote in this sample belonged to unincorporated areas or census-designated places rather than larger metropolitan statistical areas. This means that a lot of people who didn't vote weren't part of larger communities that have smaller representative governments. They're not likely to have a voice in government. They're not likely to have smaller elected officials that go to their areas and schools and canvass. They're more likely to just have to vote higher on the ballot because they'll have access to voting, but not for smaller representative positions. These sparsely populated and really isolated areas lead to, they kind of tie into this idea of who feels that their vote would matter and who cares about politics, because people who are in larger metropolitan areas, we're constantly inundated with messages about voting. Candidates are constantly speaking to us. We have our voices largely represented because we have like bigger representatives like throughout various levels of government, but it is not the same for people who are in unincorporated territories. So how can we put this data that we know, and how can we put this information about apathy as well as geography into practice? we can understand what groups do we need to mobilize. How can we, as activists, as canvassers, as political organizers, be really thoughtful about what groups we reach, even though we probably don't have the capacity to change, the structure of how people live in smaller, isolated areas. We do, as political organizers, have the capacity to listen to these people and canvass and talk to these people as people who are part of larger political campaigns. Make sure to include those particular voices, even if they don't have a direct representative, and also think about how we can modify this policy based on who feels unheard and make sure that these smaller voices are taken into account, especially when they actually consist of a large part of the population that isn't voting. And in a larger way, we can think of the pragmatic value of why we have unincorporated communities and why we have large segments of the country who are actually significantly large in terms of numbers that are not really largely incorporated into larger politics and given larger representative officials. Great, these are the sources that I used. Awesome.
Hi everyone, my name is Eloide Sode, and this past summer I worked on the project concerning media and identity, which examined the intersection between the 2016 U.S. presidential election results, media, mental health, and identity. So my focus was looking at reported incidents of harassment and kindness directed towards women after the election. So I performed a content analysis of the qualitative data we received and determined the themes that were prominent within those incidents. So I'll first begin with incidents of harassment directed towards women. As you can see, this is a graphical representation of the themes that I identified. Here there's male dominance, unsympathetic to loss, anti-Hillary, anti-female solidarity, behavior explained by Trump, sexual harassment, physical violence, gender identity, workplace, and sexual orientation. And the three most common themes were male dominance with 48%, unsympathetic to loss with 44%, and anti-Hillary, anti-female solidarity with 41%. And I'll go into detail about what these themes mean. So we received over 1,500 survey responses, and 22% reported incidents of harassment, 20% of which were related to gender. So male dominance is described as incidents in which males asserted their superiority over women and tried to reinforce female submission. So for example, men asserted their dominance through intimidation and threats of violence, as well as condescension of women's intelligence and dismissals of women's feelings. So for example, one respondent said, the day after the election, my biracial daughter, age 44, overheard some young white men talking loudly in an airport in Southern California, saying things like, "Look out, women, we can do whatever we want now." She felt quite intimidated and shocked. Unsympathetic to loss is described as incidents in which there was taunting and gloating by non-Secretary Clinton supporters who were unsympathetic to the loss felt by Clinton supporters. Then anti-Hillary, anti-female solidarity is described as incidents in which there was anti-Hillary rhetoric, and or incidents in which some rejected the notion of voting for Clinton simply because they identified with the same gender. Behavior explained by Trump are behaviors justified using Trump rhetoric and his election, or incidents in which harassers were wearing Trump apparel at the time. Then sexual harassment are incidents in which sexually explicit name calling or threats. So for example, an incident of behavior explained by Trump, here at the bottom, my 36-year-old female minister was approached by a man at a filling station who said, "Now that Trump won, I can grab you by the pussy," which is in reference to a statement made by Trump years prior to his election. So there are also incidents of related to gender identity in which participants specifically identified their gender as the reason for their harassment, as well as sexual orientation, as shown here, where there were homophobic incidents or incidents in which someone was being targeted specifically because of their sexual preferences. And there are also incidents of physical violence where there are threats or actual acts of physical violence. And we were also interested in incidents in which harassment occurred in the workplace, whether it be in a school setting or a professional setting. So 26% of research participants stated that there was workplace harassment, 12% of which was gender-based. So for example, an incident of workplace harassment in the professional setting, my most recent boss actually said to me, "The world is run by men, get used to it." I was let go from my job because I challenged him. He had no problem telling me in public to be sweet, making a statement in an executive leadership meeting to insult me by saying, "Yes, we know nobody puts baby in a corner." And within all-male executive leadership, not one of them had the balls enough to stand up and say it was wrong. So to shift gears and begin talking about acts of kindness that were toward women after the 2016 election, again, here is a visual representation of the themes that I identified that were related to kindness. As you can see, support with 84% was the most common theme, as well as activism with 52%. And there was also community messages and dialogue. So out of our response bank, 15% reported acts of kindness and 15% were related to gender. So support were incidents in which there was emotional aid rendered or demonstrations of solidarity, as well as activism, which was described as incidents of campaigning for social and political change. So for example, one respondent said, "The staggering amount of women who showed up to the women's marches worldwide is a positive act that can be attributed to the election results." Community is described as feelings of an association with people who shared common goals and sentiments, as well as the formation of a collective. There were also incidents of dialogue, which there was open discussion and people felt comfortable enough to share their concerns with others, and also incidents where messages were being shared. So for example, one respondent gave this sign as an example that they made, where it says, "In this house we believe Black Lives Matter, women's rights are human rights, no human is illegal, science is real, love is love, kindness is everything." In addition, one respondent also said, "Someone posted on Facebook a teacher's message to her young elementary students the day after the election. It went something like this: the grown-ups have made some big choices in the election today. You can make big choices too. You can choose to be kind to each other and to listen and to respect each other every day, all day long." So there are several implications to this study. In general, respondents observed an increase in acts of oppression towards women after the 2016 election, and in part that was because some felt that President Trump's past actions and policies that are hostile to women have emboldened others who share the same sentiment to act aggressively towards women after the election. As well, these incidents were justified by men saying that because Trump said so, we can do this, or because Trump likes that. Also, the election was treated like a game to be won, in which President Trump and his supporters were considered the winners, and Secretary Clinton and her supporters were considered the losers, and Secretary Clinton's supporters were taunted and disparaged because of their support. Also, harassment occurred in all areas of life, whether it be at home, in the street, online, in the workplace, or school setting. But however, the 2016 election prompted many women to become energized and become engaged in the political process, as well as engage in their communities and create supportive networks for themselves. Thank you.